President Trump's executive orders continue to face legal hurdles as courts move to temporarily halt certain directives from going into effect. Later today, a hearing is expected to take place in a Boston courtroom over the Trump administration's plan to buy out federal employees.
Yeah, and over the weekend, a federal judge temporarily blocked Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency from accessing sensitive Treasury records, including the personal data of millions of Americans. It's after 19 states sued the president and the Treasury Secretary. A hearing on that issue is set for this Friday.
All right, NBC News legal analyst Danny Cevallos joins us now to talk more about all of this. So much happening. It's a fire hose of news and directives and then legal actions and reactions. Let's start with this hearing on the federal government's the federal bailout program. Could a judge actually block this from going into effect?
Yes, it's possible. I mean, the challengers raised two major federal statutes. One is the Administrative Procedures Act, which, by the way, is not all that reassuring because the Administrative Procedures Act challenge, like all of them, doesn't necessarily say that the agency action is illegal. It just says that they didn't follow the proper procedures in making that final agency decision. And then the other main argument is what's called the Anti-Deficiency Act. And they're saying essentially that, look, there's an appropriations period that ends on March 14. How can the federal government make this promise beyond that period without congressional authorization? Right. Now, they respond, the government responds, the administration says that, look, this is really no different than any other time we promise people employment beyond a certain date. We don't know what the future will hold. Essentially, we're asking them to continue working. We're just not expecting them to show up.
Danny, let's talk about what's going on with Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and these Treasury records. What are these 19 states arguing here?
They're arguing essentially that by Doge having access to these Treasury records, these government records, that they are unlawfully accessing private information because Doge is not a government agency. And what the judge has done, and what we're seeing a lot in these court cases, is that there just isn't time for a final decision. So we're seeing all manner of stays, administrative stays, stays because the court thinks that the challengers are likely to win on the merits. But either way, because these are coming out so fast and they affect people's rights, it's not surprising that the courts are saying, let's put a pause on all of this until we can get all the briefing in and figure out what's really going on. Because in the meantime, we don't want people to be confused about their rights or lose their rights altogether.
Danny, I want to bring up this post we saw on X over the weekend from the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He said this in part, quote, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. It's unclear whether this was a reference to a specific judgment or it was just a broad statement, but it's raising concerns among legal experts that the U.S. could be heading toward a constitutional crisis. How would you read that? And what would it mean if the executive branch refused to comply with a court order? Yeah,
if you take a look at that's really three paragraphs. The first two, he has a point there. It's that third where he makes a conclusion that judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Look, courts have been able to control the executive branch since back to the Marbury v. Madison days, to the days when people were still wearing gray wigs in court almost, that far back. And it's always been the case, not always been the case, but early in our government, it's been the case that the federal courts can review the other branch's actions. That's separation of powers, that's checks and balances, that's civics class that we had in high school. So, yes, if it's a legitimate exercise of power, then the vice president has a point. But what's legitimate? That's why we have the courts to decide what the executive branch does, whether it's legitimate or it's exceeded its powers, in which case the courts can step in and reel them back in.
All right, Danny Cevallos, nice to see you bright and early this Monday morning with our legal...
Especially because I was up late watching the Super Bowl. How
not
dare
one of those
you?
22 million calling out sick.
And I am sorry for your loss with the Chiefs, Savannah. I know,
we're
as a Taylor fan.
We're really sad for Taylor Swift's boyfriend.
Thanks,
over
Danny.
here. Thanks, Danny. All right, well, for more on what's happening today in Washington, because there is a lot, as there is every day, let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly, good morning. Great to see you. So a little bit ago, earlier in the show, we were talking about these new tariffs that President Trump is expected to announce later. Which countries could be most affected? Do we think we could see another potential delay here, kind of like when we saw tariffs threatened against Canada and Mexico? Then he hit a pause on that. What do we think is going to happen?
Well, certainly we know the president believes that tariffs are one of his best tools. He believes they bring in more money for the federal government, and we've seen him use them with blunt force and then also as a negotiating tool. So he is talking about a focus on aluminum and steel and having a broad approach, and then also enacting tariffs on any countries that also have import taxes for the United States. So any reciprocal tariffs. And so the president is going to announce some of this today, and we expect also rolling it out through the week. Part of the strategy here has been to have a very high volume of activity from the White House. So you've seen so many executive orders and different actions, and the president talking about a lot of topics, a kind of shock and awe approach. And so we already know that with Mexico and Canada, he called for tariffs and then put it on pause as he's having conversations with the various governments. I would expect more of that to happen, that the president would use this as a way to try to exert his will, his force, and to try to get things from other countries. So it is something that he will watch the market. Certainly, we already saw an initial market impact and then sort of a softening there as the day and trading went on Friday. And so this is, for the president, one of the things that he believes can improve the coffers for the U.S. He diminishes the impact of costs on everyday Americans when these taxes have to be passed on to the consumer. So we'll see how quickly he wants to actually do this. But today we expect more on this issue.
Kelly, the brand new head of the White House Budget Office, Russell Vought, announced yesterday that in essence, he's shutting down temporarily the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau headquarters. This is the agency that regulates Wall Street and protects consumers from unfair financial practices like surprise overdraft fees and lots of other things there. So what's happening there?
Well, this has such a consumer impact, but people may not feel it as quickly as they would some of the social services or benefits that come directly from the government. But this is something that really does impact Americans' lives. You're talking about all those junk fees. You're talking about how the banking community can add costs to the consumer. The president's view is that this is an agency that has picked winners and losers in the business community and targeted unfairly businesses. That is their view. And so he is putting a pause on this agency, effectively taking it over. Those employees told not to come to work, but they'll be paid working from home as they take a further look at this. It's one of those areas where this is the use of executive power that will likely be contested. Again, you talked about the courts, more of that likely coming. But people who aren't familiar with this agency might be familiar with some of the benefits. In the business community, there is a different view of this in the regulatory space, some not liking how they have been required to adhere to different rules from this agency. So it's long been controversial, but it does have a consumer component.
Kelly, some Democrats are starting to talk about a potential plan to attempt to pump the brakes on President Trump's dismantling of federal agencies, something we are just seeing at this breakneck speed. What leverage, though, do Democrats have here?
It's very difficult because Democrats do have the power of Congress's Article 1 powers of appropriating the money and approving the money. But we've already seen, because they are not in the majority, how that's a limited approach. So they're trying to speak publicly. They are trying to put political pressure, and they can use some degree of oversight from Congress to try to pump the brakes here on some of these actions. But ultimately, the courts have the most swift ability to put a pause, as we've seen in a number of these cases. Democratic allies outside of Congress who can find the right plaintiffs to litigate, people who have standing on these issues, people who can bring cases in various jurisdictions to try to slow down President Trump and his administration's push on this. But it is a challenge for Democrats. So there's a political set of steps they can try to take. They can try to work through the levers of Congress, but that may be limited at this point.
All right, Kelly O'Donnell, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.